Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today for the Japan Market Briefing and Cultural Awareness Training. It's great to see so many of you online. We're going to do a deep dive into the wine market in Japan, as well as take a closer look at the cultural aspects of doing business here. But before we begin, let's acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land.
We acknowledge the lands of the traditional custodians across Australia. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' continuing connection to land, water and sky country. We acknowledge the wine regions and hundreds of different nations around this continent and the ancient soils on which we stand and grow. From the Wadani saltwater peoples of the Margaret River in our west to the East Coast Sunrise people of the Yuin Nation and the Southern Island and Saltbush peoples of the Nioni peoples of Tasmania. Today and always, we pay our deep respects to the custodians, those who went before and those who will follow, as the knowledge holders of tomorrow. This is Australia.
Good afternoon. I'm Rose McDonald, Country Manager of Japan for Wine Australia. Before we get into the content for today, we'll just do a little bit of housekeeping. So at the right of your screen, you will find a chat and a QA function. To join the conversation, you can post directly into the chat. And to ask a question, simply click on the Add to Q&A button. We have experts today from Austrade and Value Learning, so we endeavour to answer as many questions as possible, time permitting. Any questions that can't be answered today will be followed up after the session. A recording of today's webinar will also be emailed to all attendees tomorrow. Lastly, if you're having any technical issues, we recommend that you refresh your URL or browser or pop a comment into the chat. Let's begin. So firstly, I would like to introduce Murray Spence, who is Trade Commissioner and Councillor Commercial for Austrade Tokyo, who will give an overview of the wine market in Japan. Over to you, Murray.
Thank you very much, Rose, and good afternoon from Tokyo. As Rose has mentioned, my name is Murray Spence and I'm a Trade and Investment Commissioner here, covering the food and agribusiness sector. Our topic today is, of course, wine, and in my presentation, I'm going to be covering the following topics. I just think, the presentation has, there we go. Oh. The presentation's popping up and down, just a second. There we go. So the topics we're going to cover today, I want to just start by giving you an overview of Japan. I'm not sure where you all sit within the general knowledge area, so we'll cover that. Then, of course, we'll go into more detail on the wine market here, cover some opportunities, and then just talk about a project that Austrade is initiating at this very moment to be held and completed next year. So if we look at Japan, I'd like to start by mentioning that, of course, it's the world's third largest economy with an annual GDP of $5.1 trillion US. It's a major trading nation and one of the largest international investors in the world, a member of the G7 and the G20. And of course, it's a nation every country wants to be involved with. It is the international trade, is what I'm trying to say, is the lifeblood of Japan's economy. So it's a democracy moving on. As you know, we have a prime minister here as the head of government, but it also retains a patriarchal monarchy with the emperor as the head of state. Japan is politically very stable and very conservative. The Liberal Democratic Party has held power here for 64 of the 66 years since it was established in 1995. The population is 5 times that of Australia at 126.2 million and has been in decline for the last 10 years. It's characterised by a low birth rate, a large and growing silver demographic with about 28% of all people aged over 65, and an increasing number of what we refer to as super solos. So by 2040, it's estimated that 50% of households will consist of a single member. Japan has one of the lowest food self-sufficiency rates among the major world economies at around 38%. And of course, this logically means that it imports approximately 60% of its food. And this is why it is so active in international trade. The Australia-Japan partnership is one of our closest and most mature in Asia and is fundamentally important to both countries' strategic and economic interests. Japan is Australia's second largest trading partner and the second largest export market and the third largest source of foreign direct investment. The Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, or JPA, entered into force in 2015 and is now fully implemented. It supported a rise in two-way trade of some 31% since it was implemented. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, which entered into force in 2018, continued to eliminate a number of tariffs on products such as butter, muesli, and honey that were not included in JPA. And just to mention that under JPA, Australian wine now has zero tariff on it as entry into Japan. Just carrying on along here, Japan's e-commerce market is estimated to be worth about $104 billion US, making it the fourth largest in the world, with two major platforms, Rakuten and Amazon, being dominant in the market. Smartphone user penetration is high, with Line as the most popular online communication tool, with approximately 84 million active users monthly. Finally, Japan ranks 29th in the world for ease of doing business. So the Japan of today is vastly improved to this time last year, and that's a really good story. A mere 12 months ago, the country was operating under a quasi-state of emergency with remote working, shortened business hours for restaurants and bars, and restrictions on events. You may recall that Japan chose to deliver an Olympic Games devoid of spectators. At that time, the rollout of the vaccines was slow due to accessibility limitations and vaccination hesitancy. And with closed borders, the whole tourism industry here in Japan collapsed. At the time of the onset of COVID, Japan was welcoming 31 million visitors a year. So that was a devastating effect on the food service sector. But however, there was no shortage of food supplies in Japan because some imported food products were overstocked, having been ordered in anticipation of a tourist influx around the Olympics. And that actually happened twice because, as you recall, the Olympics was extended a year, and so more orders were placed and we had more food come in, and of course, no one could attend. So today the country is open and operating under COVID normal conditions. COVID cases today are approximately 50,000 new cases a day throughout the entire country, which based on a population of 126 million is not so concerning. And about 5,000 of those are in Tokyo. Of course, the big difference is everyone is now double or triple vaccinated. The border is open to triple vaccinated tourists and visas are no longer required. People are returning to work. However, mask usage remains the norm, especially in public areas, on public transport, in supermarkets and shops. Given the effect of COVID, new challenges have emerged here in Japan. Like other currencies, the yen has dropped against the American greenback and has readjusted against others, including the Australian dollar. So it has actually dropped 16% against the Australian dollar in the last 4 to 5 months. So it went from 80 yen. Now it's about approximately 95 yen to the dollar. So if you're thinking of coming to Japan, now's a good time to grab your yen. Higher production costs overseas, including in Australia, have made imports more expensive. So that's a bit of a double whammy on top of the devalued yen. And these costs are trickling through to the consumer. Inflation in October alone was 3%. Which may not be too concerning given the rate is 7% in Australia. But if you think that for the last three decades, Japan has had either deflation or stagnation, this is a 40-year high. And in comparison, to give you some idea, average wage growth in the last 30 years has been a mere 4%. So quite low. Okay, so let's go on to wine. So this graph here presents to you alcohol sales in Japan. This is a comparison made 2020-2021, so under COVID. You can see that alcohol sales decreased by 2%, and that from this graph, only 4% of total alcohol sales are composed of wine. If you look on the right-hand side, you can see a breakdown of the average expenditure for households, and it reveals that Japanese consumers only spend about 5% of their income on alcoholic beverages, and that over this period, household expenditure on wine decreased by 2% on average. Post-COVID, there's actually been a 33% decrease in spending of alcohol outside of the home. So what we're finding here is that even though people are returning to work, they are deciding or preferring to go home to eat rather than dining out. So food service is coming back, but it's not rebounding as quickly or as strongly as was anticipated. You can see here, this is an overview of the wine market. So still wine sales is about 337.9 million litres. That's down 3% from 2020, and it's about 4% of total alcohol sales. Of this amount, you can see imported wine is a massive 66.8%. The top 5 countries of origin for imported wine is France, and you can see they have a lion's share of the market at 24%. And then followed by Chile, a different position, about at 23%, Italy, Spain, and then we have Australia in 5th place with only 3.9% of the market. We can see here some trends from what happened during the pandemic. You can see in 2021, from January to September, premise businesses were hit hard. This was the restriction of the government on operating hours, and also the fact that restaurants and food service venues were not allowed to serve alcohol. There was a reason behind this, but we won't go into it here. This was counterbalanced, of course, by a growth in liquor sales through alcohol stores, basically for home consumption. And you can see that jumped a massive 32.8%. Department stores are also another source for alcohol purchases, and they increased 20%. And you can see here, e-commerce channels also increased 2%. Interestingly too, the unit price per wine for home consumption went up. So it would appear that with not having to pay perhaps higher prices at food service venues, people were quite willing to spend a little bit more to enjoy a really good quality premium wine at home with their meal. Of course, at the moment, it was a challenging time for new brands to enter the market. And now that things have loosened up, and we'll go into that in a minute, there's quite a rush for new brands to come into the market, but also importers are engaging once again. They've cleared their stocks that were there from the Olympics. With food service happening again, there's those channels open again, there's more flowing through. So importers here are looking and starting to look for new brands and new varietals for the next season. So here we have on this slide the wine sales of the top 11 countries. This is for imported wine. You can see that from this table, 75% of the wines are priced under $16, basically under $17 per bottle. But interestingly enough, you can see here highlighted in red as well, the sales of wines priced higher than $16.60 actually increased in 2021. So again, that's a reflection of people willing to invest in something a little bit nicer to consume at home. So, consumers during this time, they had less opportunities to travel, less opportunities to buy things. I mean, of course, we all know that online sales went through the roof and e-commerce platforms enjoyed growth, but they also had less time to eat out. So they were quite willing to pay a little bit more on perhaps for more limited occasions when they chose to drink. Retailers increased the price point of the volume sales in wine as well, which was interesting. And the increased uptick in home consumption obviously increased sales through general liquor stores and department stores. We sort of mentioned that in the previous slide. Yeah. So it's a good indication that people will pay for higher priced wines. So that's very encouraging. So this slide obviously is showing the route to market. Distribution channels into Japan are clear and quite easy to understand. Whole products like wine typically flow through to market through an importer, through to a wholesaler, and then are on-sold to resellers or direct to retail and on-premise businesses. A major trend that we've highlighted here in red that emerged during the pandemic is the boom in e-commerce. So many brick and mortar organizations and stores that had neglected the e-commerce channel scrambled to get stores online. And we also saw some importers and some wholesalers launch platforms. So they will, this makes sense given that they have the logistics in place to store and dispatch stock. But it was quite surprising given that traditionally each party in the supply chain values and respects their relationship with their partners. But we did find that some companies that were overstocked were setting up e-commerce channels and reaching out direct to consumers and end users, offering them bargains, trying to clear some of their stock. Right, this slide references, of course, sales of Australian wines. So you can see that based on the data we have to hand, total sales of Australian wines has decreased 12%. And that 87% of Australian wines sell for less than $16.60. That said, there was an uptick in sales of wines at the medium or a higher price point between $16.60 and about $22. And then also we saw another uptick in more expensive premium wines, say $22 to $33 here. So, I mean, Austrade works very hard with our partners here in market, the state partners, and of course also with Wine Australia to try and elevate and reposition Australian wines in Japan. And we do focus on the premium market. Our sort of thinking is that, you know, the interesting wines start from around $30. So they can offer much better value than the same price positioned wines from other countries. So we do have that on our radar. So as you can see here, just carrying on, sparkling wine accounted for total imports increased 9%, and in the sparkling wine category, Australia is positioned at number 5, 3.3% of the share of total imported sparkling wines, which is obviously still very, very low, and it did drop slightly during the COVID era. Okay, so this slide here shows you Australian wine sales by channel. You can see that most of the Australian wine is sold at supermarkets, convenience stores, and liquor shops. You can go into any convenience store here in Japan, I think the whole length of the country, and find Australian wines available on the shelf. Most supermarkets will sell 2 to 3 well-known Australian brands, and we can also see that during COVID, there's been an increase in sales through general liquor shops with increase in Australian wines occurring. So I think that we need to convince the consumer here. As I've mentioned already, Austrade works very hard to try and elevate the position of Australian wine, and we're working hard to elevate from this lower price point where we are competing with wines from Chile and Spain, these sorts of lower countries, to a more middle or premium wine. So we also are focused on selling Australian wines in restaurants and pairing it with good both local cuisine and also Australian influenced cuisine. So we find that in the food service sector, of course, the preference is French, Italian or Spanish wines, but there's no real reason why restaurants would not use Australian wines because we have such a depth of variety, and the quality, as you know, is outstanding. So here I'd like to reference some market opportunities. Honestly speaking, Japan's wine market is mature and there's little room for organic growth due to the high saturation. This makes the market very, very competitive. And consumers here, wine consumers, have a sophisticated palate from the broad selection of varietals on offer. Japanese consumers are also very interested to know what they are eating and what they are drinking and where it has come from. So this provides opportunity for products with a strong brand narrative and provenance. You can see here, just running down the list, entry price wines there is still potential here. There's much more interest, however, in gold medal award-winning wines, natural wines, hands-off wines, skin contact white wines, organic and organically certified wines, of course, are very interested because there's a strong awareness here of clean, green and safe, and sustainability and provenance are major themes. There's also, interestingly, we've seen an uptick in demand for canned wines or small-sized wines, and this relates, of course, to the smaller household size. So also, I think you may be aware, Japanese homes are smaller than Western homes, so people like to sit and they don't really have room to store things for a start, and they don't want a big bottle of wine sitting in the fridge, so there is opportunity for smaller-sized wines. We are also seeing increased opportunity for non-alcoholic, natural and minimal intervention wines at the entry level. And here on the slide, you can see the top 5 organic and biodynamic imported wines and their performance. You can see some have had quite an uptick, growth of 29 and 42% is quite substantial. So as a precursor to the cultural training to follow, I just wanted to highlight the expectations of the Japanese partners that you could be working with here in market, and how that might contrast or have an effect to your operation back in Australia. So working in Japan, there is a high respect here in Japan for hierarchy and age. And Japan, secondly, is a relationship-based market. It's not transactional. Partners here will be interested in working with you, getting to know you, and to having a long-term relationship with you. There's also a thinking that their business is your business is their business. You're in this together. It's not transactional here. Here's a palette of our beautiful wine. Thank you for selling it. We would like to work with you. How can we help promote it in market? What can we do? What support do you need? Please visit us anytime. Let us show you through our vineyard. So there is this reciprocity, and there is an expectation that if you really want to build your brand in the market, you should be investing, be it with regards to energy or time or even financial resources, marketing materials, in the activity here in Japan. Japan is a very face-conscious culture. They're very concerned about how they're perceived, and obviously the consensus here is on harmony, of working cooperating together in a very productive and harmonious way. People are always polite. They are incredibly professional. If you come up here, there is an expectation that someone senior, the owner or perhaps the operator of the vineyard or a winemaker is visiting, rather than an export manager. Or if they are coming up, they are accompanied by the export manager. And this is a country that still loves a business card. So please make sure you have some when you come up here. What this means for you back at the winery is Japanese importers will be wanting to come down for inspections. They'll expect things to be certified. They expect you to provide the same quality consistently at the same price in the condition that you've promised on an ongoing basis. So it's really about consistency, and this goes to the minutest detail. So you can see here scuff testing on caps, labels, cartons. The packaging should be good, and it should be delivered in perfect condition and consistently. Forms. There's a lot of detail to get through in Japan. Labels and packaging should be upgraded, and they should be known about that. You need to be very responsive to them. Don't just think, oh, there's an email, I'll get back to that when I've got time. They expect you to respond. And then, of course, point of sales. If you can help with branding materials that they can have translated here to help with promotion, that's always appreciated. So I think that there'll be more detail on this as the webinar goes on, but that's just from a very high level overview. So I'd just like to wrap up really with introducing a new to wine market project that Austrade is in the midst of delivering. So we ran this also in the current year. This will be delivered next year, but we did that this year. And it's basically it's a multifaceted campaign, actually. We're working with a local wine association and some of the top sommelier on a blind wine tasting of Australian new to market wines, not in market, but new to market wines. So you can apply for this. Basically, the Sommelier and the Wine Association will pick, there's five categories basically defined by price and by varietal, so red or white or open. And you can submit up to 3 bottles for blind wine tasting. And then from the selected wines, well, from the wines that are submitted for tasting, 3 in each of the 5 categories will be recognized for their quality and suitability to the Japanese consumer's palate. Then we will promote these, and then using the final 2 bottles, we actually have a blind wine tasting for industry partners, one in Tokyo and one in Osaka, and this is planned for April next year. As I've mentioned already, we did this project this year in very challenging circumstances, and I'm very pleased to say that we had quite a few, well, we had some labels picked up and sales are starting to flow into market. So I think this is a very, very good opportunity for you if you are interested to submit 3 bottles of your wine to Japan to assess whether it's suited to the Japanese market. You can see here we're working with the state and territory partners, and that depending on which state you are in, the cost is slightly different. Some states are subsidizing, some are paying for it completely, and some are not. So expressions of interest are due the 11th of November. If you are interested in this, please reach out to Wine Australia or to myself or to my business development manager here, Yoko Yamamura, and we will be delighted to forward the expression of interest through to you. Given that we're on the 3rd of November, you have approximately a week to do that, but the cost is very low, and the exposure you can get through this to the Japanese industry and the consumer is quite important. So here on the screen is my contact details, my email, murray.spence@austrade.gov.au, and my business development manager covering the wine and beverages sector is Yoko Yamamura. Please reach out to us. And that's it.
Great, thank you so much, Murray, for your valuable insights into the Japan wine market. Just before we jump into questions, I'd like to also share a couple of slides from the Wine Australia site. Just one moment, I'll share my screen. Here we go. So just a snapshot into some of our recent activities or a recent win. So this was the Tokyo Trade Tasting that was held on the 11th of October. And it was a great opportunity to really reconnect with trade and reaffirm our commitment to the Japanese market after a brief spell with COVID, or a long spell with COVID. So on the day we were showing over 300 wines from 87 wineries, and we held 3 masterclasses that were hosted by Andrea Pritzer from Australia and translated by Yoko Obata, who's also a wine educator and a Master of Wine student. These were very well received by trade. As you can see in the photo, they were fully booked. So that was a great response. It was also attended by the Minister of Trade and Tourism, Hondong Karo, who used the opportunity to announce also my position as a Japan country manager, which is really a sign of our commitment to the Japanese market. Just to give you a little bit of background as well on myself. So I came into the role 1 month ago, but I entered the industry working for Pernod Ricard winemakers, and I was working as a wine ambassador in Japan for 2 years. And then after that, moving to Pernod Ricard Japan, working with spirits, so Irish whiskey, white spirits, and then most recently Kinobi Kyoto dry gin. So it's really a sign of our commitment to the Japanese market to have someone on the ground who's here to work with trade and to work with consumers as well. The event was attended by key trade media, which is great to amplify our message and to really show that we're really putting full power into the Japanese market again. And just going on to the next slide, I just wanted to take a moment to share our objective for Wine Australia in Japan, which is to propel the growth and drive premium cues of Australian wine. We have 2 very clear objectives, which is to increase consumer demand and to increase trade demand as well. So the way that we will do this is by doing consumer and trade activation, establishing communication tools, which are social media, so local social media, and also a Japanese language webpage, where we can communicate the latest events and news to communicate with our consumers. Education. So we have a great tool called Australian Wine Discovered. We now have 17 modules in Japanese, which will be a valuable asset for when we're working with importers, with sommeliers, also with consumers, so that we can really show some of the practices that we have in Japan, the different varieties, the different sustainable practices, to really show the value of Australian wine, and coordination with local and state organisations. So that's just a snapshot into what our activities will be going on into the future. And now I would like to open up the floor to any questions that you have for Murray, anything about the Japanese wine market, any questions that you may have if you're already existing in market or considering new to market. Just to kick things off, I have a question. So you talked a little bit, Murray, about new to market wine and what some of the wine trends. So when a winery is maybe selecting what wines they would submit to new to market, what are the 3 key things that you would recommend they consider?
So I think obviously it's how is the wine made, because I think can your wine be imported into Japan, I think is a key factor, because there are certain chemicals or certain methods where you cannot import it into Japan. So that's number one. I think the second one is availability. So how do you want to position your wine? So first, I mean, there's 2 things here, I guess. One is, what is unique about your wine? This is a saturated market, and the wine is coming in from all of the wonderful countries that are producing wine all over the world. So how are you going to differentiate yourself? You know, what is distinct or unique about your wine? Some of the interesting things I encountered last year was orange wines. I'd never seen an orange wine before. So, you know, to see that sort of thing. And as we've mentioned already, you know, low alcohol wines, these sorts of differentiating factors, maybe it's some of the production methods, but just what is unique about your wine. And second, I think about is availability. Are you able to, what channel are you looking for? Are you looking for a niche position with a limited, I mean, Japanese people here, they love limited editions or restricted availability. They're great consumers. They want the next big trend. And if there's a product that's available, but there's only 10 cases available in Japan, or look at, you know, you can talk about Beaujolais Nouveau, right? They love it because it's such a short time it's available. So how are you going to position it, and how are you going to make sure that you get that placement in the market? So if you have some clear vision around this, then I think that you can enter into an interesting discussion with an importer.
That's great advice. Thank you. I can see nothing's coming through at the moment, but I do know it's a lot of information all at once. So as we progress through the call, if anyone has any further questions, please put into the chat, and then we'll enter any answers into the chat or follow it up after the call today. So thank you very much, Murray, for your time.
Pleasure.
It was great to have you.
And just let me say, Rosemary, it's wonderful to have you in market. And I think a great recognition of the importance of your role is the fact that the Trade and Tourism Minister was there to announce your appointment. So congratulations, and we look forward to continuing working with you.
Oh, thank you so much. That's really wonderful to hear. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. So now that we have an understanding of the wine landscape, I'd like to hand over to Marcela Lapatosa, Director of Education from Value Learning, who, along with her team, will explore the cultural aspects that are important to understand before conducting business in Japan. So over to you, Marcela.
Hi, Rose. Thank you so much for the introduction. Let me just get our presentation ready. Good. Welcome, everyone. Great to see so many people interested in this topic and exporting to Japan. My name is Marcela Lapatosa. I'm the Director of Education for Value Learning, and I'm here with Yori Forsyth. Yori, I could not think of any better person to do this than her. She's bilingual and bicultural. She grew up between Australia and Japan, and of course, she has many fun stories to tell. But today, she's here to help us understand a bit better what the Japanese culture is and how can we work better to make sure that we can export to that market. So we got some insights from Murray, and Yori and I are going to go a bit deeper on that today. And she's currently working for Austrade in the international education sector. So what are we going to do in the next, do we have? 45, 50 minutes. We want to introduce the concept of intercultural competence and why is it important to understand culture when you're doing business, and also find ways to navigate cultural differences when doing business. And we're going to go into the specifics of Japanese cultural values and how can we be more effective in that context. Yori also has some important stuff around business cards. There is a lot of protocol around it, and she's going to share that with us once we explore some of those values. So let's start with some facts. I'm going to hand it over to Yori for that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marcella, and lovely to be here. Thank you for having me in this session today. My name is Iori Forsyth. Today, I'll firstly start off with some Japan facts I think would be of interest to our audiences today. I'll start with some key facts before diving into some of the key concepts of Japanese culture and business culture specifically. So if this works, yep. So firstly, Japan, the Japanese characters that make up Japan's name, Nihon or Nippon, is a literal translation of sun origin, which is why Japan is often referred to as the land of the rising sun. Murray mentioned in his presentation Japan's population of 126 million people, with the greater Tokyo area, so that includes Tokyo and the surrounding 3 metro cities, is actually the world's most populous city with over 36 million people. So this actually covers 25% of Japan's entire population, and also still more than Australia's whole population. So Australia, I think, is just over 25 million. And to think that you can fit that whole country 20 times into the size of Australia, and that's not the only surprising part. When you think of that amount of people living in a relatively small land area, you might imagine, majority of the country being occupied with people. But Japan is actually one of the most heavily wooded or mountainous countries in the world, with 67% of its land covered by forests. So very surprising facts there, I think, for some people. The last line is just an overview of the religious demographic in Japan. So moving on to more facts, another interesting fact, and this might not be surprising, but in a world that is becoming increasingly multicultural, Japan is still a very monocultural country, with over 98% of the population being ethnically Japanese, which actually relates to why Japan uses such high context communication. And I'll go in a little bit more about what the high context communication is a little later on. But high context cultures like Japan tend to convey information indirectly to maintain harmony, avoid conflict, or risk offending other people, offending each other. And this tends to happen in monocultural societies when the majority of the population has similar upbringings, similar experiences, and similar understandings of the environment, compared to Australia, which is actually on the other side of the spectrum, being quite low context in their communication style. The communication style is quite direct, and this is necessary to avoid confusion and misunderstanding within a population which comprises of many different backgrounds and upbringings. So Australia, as you know, is a very multicultural country, with 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 Australians having a background from countries outside of Australia. So the context there with the monoculture and the multicultural, I thought, was an important difference and fact to note when talking about Japan. In Murray's presentation, he also noted the aging population in Japan, over 28% of the Japanese population being 65 years and older. Relating to that, Japan also has a very high life expectancy, if not the highest, with around 2.3 million people over the age of 90. And on the slide here, I've written 71,000, but actually this morning I found a new statistic from September 2022, and it's actually over 90,000 people in Japan are over the age of 100. And this is said to be attributed to Japan's historically healthier diet. I thought Murray's point, if you remember on his first slide, he mentioned the super solo society. I think that was really important and a really good point. He mentioned that single households in Japan will occupy 50% of Japan's households by 2040. So in reality, less Japanese men and women are getting married or either delaying their marriage. And a lot of young people are actually preferring to spend their time alone. And there are actually buzzwords for that. Japan loves buzzwords. And there's one called Ohitori-sama, which is loosely translated to party of one, or sorokatsu, which is solo, and katsu, which is short for katsudo, meaning activity. So solo activity, one person activity. So those kind of buzzwords are trending in Japan, and obviously doesn't help with Japan's aging population and the declining birth rate. But there's literally solo everything these days in Japan. There's solo karaoke, solo ramen, solo movies, solo traveling, solo camping. So this is, I think, was a really important trend that he mentioned in terms of when you're thinking about marketing products in Japan. It's really important to be targeting those, the solo demographic, I think, which is really, really increasing in Japan. So Japan has a strong focus on education as well, being one of the most literate countries in the world. Japan has one of the world's largest proportion of citizens holding a tertiary education degree. Japan comes in second, I think, after Canada, with 52.68% of people with holding a tertiary education. Australia currently sits at ninth, which is also high, with 49.34%. So just an overview on the Japanese language. So Nihongo, Japanese language, is the national language and is said to be one of the most complex languages from an English speaker's point of view, with 3 separate writing systems. So there's the kanji, derived from the Chinese characters hiragana and katakana. And we also have it's said to have about 47 different variety of dialects. So the number 47 comes from the number of prefectures in Japan. There are very small differences between dialects between each prefecture, and sometimes even slightly within prefectures. Me personally, I speak the Hiroshima dialect, which is actually quite different to the type of Japanese that the people in Tokyo speak, but everyone understands each other. These dialects are mutually intelligible. Everyone understands each other for the most part. There are some exceptions with, some of the elderly citizens living in very remote villages. I think sometimes their dialects are really difficult to understand. But in the most part, everyone in Japan, even within dialects, understand each other. The standard dialect, which is known as the Hyojungo, is based on the dialect of Tokyo, and is the main Nihongo that is used in business, government, and media. And it will be the Japanese that people abroad will be learning in any Japanese classrooms abroad. For spoken Japanese, to make things even more complex, we have what is called the casual language and the formal language when we're speaking Japanese. And then also there are 3 levels within the formal language as well. So very complex. The formal language can be loosely translated to polite language, teinego, respectful language, sonkego, and humble language, kenjogo. So the polite language within the formal language will be the base of the Japanese that, if you've ever learnt Japanese in school or university, so that will be the base Japanese that foreigners will learn in the classroom. So lastly, speaking of language, Japan also has one of the lowest levels of English competency globally. They actually come in 78th out of 112 countries. An estimation of 30%, only 30% of Japanese are said to speak English, and less than 8% are said to actually speak it fluently. So this is why it is really important to have, Japanese translated marketing collaterals such as brochures and promotional materials as much as possible, when doing business in Japan or going to Japan for meetings, and often needing translators for important meetings and business matching events in Japan. So that is just a bit of an overview of some of the Japan facts that I thought would be interesting. And now to talk about culture in general. So I will back to you, Marcella.
Thank you, Yori. And that's fantastic. It's really good how some simple facts really get you thinking about some of the considerations you need to have in terms of your marketing, in terms of how you're going to set up your business there. But just before going into the specifics of the Japanese value, we thought it's important to understand the intercultural competence is the ability to interact effectively and appropriately with people from different cultural backgrounds. And effective means that you achieve your goal. So if we think in this context, effective will be that you get to sell your wine in the Japanese market, but appropriately is doing it in a way that makes sense for the others, that is respectful for the values of those others. So in this case, again, will be how can you sell that wine in a way that makes sense for the Japanese people. And I'm thinking of the solo concept. Maybe there is some space for some solo wine branding there happening, and maybe someone has already done it. So then this means that when we have intercultural competence, that we are aware of ourselves, we are aware of others, and we then have the ability to build those bridges between the two differences. And we're always focusing on learning about the others, but self-awareness is super important as well as a starting point. Because culture is that set of learned and shared beliefs, behaviors, and values of a group of interactive people that pass generation through generation. So there is a shared understanding of those values and those beliefs and what's wrong and what's right in a certain setting. And we can think of culture as an iceberg, right? So we only see 10% of it, the top of the iceberg. So what people wear, what they eat, how they speak, how they behave. But we don't see 90% of why they behave the way they behave. And we're going to go into that in a little bit. But there is this communication styles differences between cultures, and we can think about Japan and Australia, like Yori was sharing about this high and low context. And we'll go into that in a little bit more specifics. But how do people engage in conflict, and why do they do it that way? How is power distributed and managed in society? So all those concepts and values influence the way we behave and the behaviors we see. So it's very important to have that little diving under the cold waters to better understand and to be more equipped to interact with those and do business in those different cultures. And why we're saying this is because if we think about the Australian icebergs, think of all of us here, and you might come from different cultures as well. So I'm Argentinian Australian, so my iceberg is a bit multicultural as well. But there is a way in which I like to do business. So most commonly, if you think about the Australian iceberg, Australians are rule compliant. There is a preferred style of direct communication happening. We tend to be more egalitarian, more casual, easygoing in our way of doing business, tend to be transparent, and also low context communication. And that's because we don't share the same context, right? With being such a multicultural society, context is very different to everyone. So we need to be very specific when we speak, very direct, very detailed for the others to understand that. So this is the way most Australians like to do business, or this is the way it's most accepted to do business in Australia, right? But what's important is that we don't see things the way they are, but the way we are. So we can't go with this way of being or this way of doing business to other contexts, because we will not be effective and appropriate. So this is the first step, is this self-awareness of how we like to do business. And I invite everyone to think a bit about how do you approach new businesses in Australia, but also overseas. And then go into understanding how do the others like to do business. And we're going to go into the Japanese way in a minute to then understand, okay, what can I do? How can I change my behavior? How can I adapt to make sure that I can be effective and appropriate and get to sell my wine in a way that makes sense in that context? So having seen this, let's have a look at the Japanese iceberg now. And we're going to go back to Yori for that part.
Thank you very much. So moving on to the Japanese iceberg. So thank you for putting this slide together, Marcella. When I first saw this slide, I was thinking, why is that person holding toilet paper with the chopsticks, and realized that it was sushi. So that was just a little bit funny. But when I think of Japanese business culture in a nutshell, that might be under the iceberg, I think of four main concepts, which is what I'll be diving into in my presentation today. And that's, the formality, the hierarchy, the harmony, and the loyalty, the loyals part of Japan, which, sometimes I think when you're doing business, or when you're thinking about Japanese culture, it's not actually the things that you see on the top, and there's a lot of deep rooted, I guess, culture that goes within each of these concepts. So I'll dive into each of these concepts now. And the first one being, and this might not be obviously surprising for anyone, but Japanese culture is very formal. And I've kind of put it in 3 different, I guess, notes today, being greeting, bowing, and business attire, which kind of showcases really easy to understand the formality that Japanese people follow in business context. When we're talking about greeting, the most common form of greeting in Japan is a bow. It's called ojigi in Japanese. Which does vary depending on the context and social relationship between 2 parties. In a business meeting context, the most senior member of a delegation or a meeting situation should be greeted first. And also, I think for Australians, it's a natural instinct, I think, to go for a handshake to begin with. And in Japan, when I think Japanese business meet with foreigners in a business context, they may choose to shake hands as well, just like you're all learning about the way Japanese people do things and do business. The Japanese side is also conscious about learning the way foreigners do business and things as well. So I think the best approach is to follow the lead of your Japanese counterpart and greet them in the same manner. But for Japanese people doing business with each other, definitely there are no really personal touch involved when people greet each other. The bowing that I mentioned, the ojigi, is really important. The depth of the bow actually depends on your counterpart status. So if someone is more senior than you, your bow should actually be lower than theirs and also be held for longer as well. Just in terms of related to greeting, you might, and if you've ever been to Japan or have worked in Japan, you would know that people refer to each other as san. So something san. So it's important in Japan to address your Japanese counterpart, to not address your Japanese counterpart by their first name, like you do perhaps in Australia, unless invited to do so. So either use Mr. or Miss, or add a san to their family name. So, for example, if their name was Hiroshi Watanabe, for example, instead of calling them Hiroshi, it would be appropriate to call them Watanabe-san. In terms of business attire, you would see, this is, I think, a very classic photo of a Japanese commute. Many Japanese people, and I'm talking specifically about men here, but in Japanese business, Japanese men do wear a very simple black or grey or navy suit, and a lot of people will avoid any bright colors in their business attire. Japanese summer, as you may know, is really, really hot and humid. So in summer, most Japanese men wear half sleeve shirts during the summer months. This was due to actually in the 2000s, if you remember Prime Minister Koizumi, he was called the salaryman Prime Minister at the time. He passed this new regulation called the Cool Biz, which actually allowed government male employees in Japan to forego ties and unbutton their collars in the summer months. And then soon after that, private companies followed. So since then, only not many Japanese salarymen, except for, I guess, salespeople, wear ties in summer. So even though some companies might insist their male employees to wear ties during meetings in summer, you'll see, and I've been in situations many times in meetings where you sit down and people, the first thing they say is, can we please take our ties off? And everyone at the same time takes their tie off. So the tie is kind of the formal part of starting it, and then it's quite acceptable to remove the tie during the meeting. So the next, I guess, concept that I'll be touching on is the hierarchy, and all these are kind of interconnected with each other, the different concepts that I'll be diving into. So in Japan, your relative status and rank in an organization determines how you interact with each other. So authority is strongly respected, and often authority comes with age even a year or two of your seniority makes a difference. Year or two senior in age makes a difference. And not just in business context, but even in friendships and social interactions as well. I think age and hierarchy is very ingrained in Japanese culture. The Japanese language itself, as you remember, the formal language, and even within the formal language itself is, as you heard, has built-in ways to show respect and humility. So as an example of, so the hierarchy plays a role also in decision-making processes and in negotiations as well. So in Japan, individual preferences are less important than having a sense of belonging to a group and maintaining harmony amongst its members and colleagues. So consensus is stressed as the primary way to arrive at decisions, and decisions itself are understood as the sum of all contributions. And an important part of building consensus is this informal process referred to as nemawashi in Japanese. So the term nemawashi literally translates to going around the roots. And it refers to how, for example, a gardener, when they dig around the roots of a plant to prepare for it to be replanted, they go around the roots. So the process of consensus in Japan requires the leader or the manager to prepare the foundations for the proposed change or project or whatever is being talked about in the meeting. So preparing the foundations and talking to others, gathering information and feedback and so forth before going into the meeting. So it is a time-consuming process, but it is seen as a necessary way to promote both group and individual interests. But in Japan, once a decision is made, implementation is usually relatively smooth, since most stakeholders in the meeting have already been consulted and involved. So obviously the feasibility of the change or the project has already been established. But this concept of nemawashi is a really important one in Japan, and is something that is really practiced when people are making decisions internally, but also when talking to business partners and talking about potential contracts and things like that. So it's all around, I guess, the hierarchy nature of Japan. So let's go. So the third concept is I'm going to be talking about is the harmony side. And you may have heard about the concept of face. It's common in a lot of Asian cultures, and in Japan, face or mentsu in Japanese is really important to understand. So in Japan, face, mentsu, is connected to dignity, honor, and reputation. So you can lose face, you can gain face, you can protect face. Actually, in Japanese, losing face is actually directly translated to crushing face, which sounds pretty traumatic. But for example, someone could lose face in Japan by being blamed for something in front of others, or someone can also gain face, for example, by being praised in front of others. So protecting your face and others' face is crucial in Japanese culture, as it helps to maintain group harmony. And in that context, you'll find that Japanese people rarely show public displays of anger, as this would cause both themselves and the recipient of their anger to lose face in front of everyone. So it's not to say that it's not expressed in a different way, but on the whole, you'll find that people speak to each other quite calmly and respectfully to protect harmony within the workplace. And this is, related to the saving face and the protecting face side of, keeping the harmony together. I mentioned in my introduction about Japan's high context culture. In high context cultures like Japan, people tend to convey information indirectly to maintain harmony and avoid conflict and risk offending each other. So in Japan, I guess indirect often equates to being polite. You might have heard that Japanese people tend to avoid saying yes or no directly in business meetings. So, for example, some phrases that Japanese people might use in meetings that almost always means no, maybe, something like, oh, that's difficult, or, oh, we're not really certain about this. If you hear them say that, this is most likely they're trying to say is no, but they're not. They're being indirect about it, and they're being polite about the way they say it. But they're assuming that you would understand that what they're saying means no. Other phrases that may also often mean no, depending on the context, might be something like, oh, we'll need to study this issue further, or this is very interesting, can also mean no as well. So if you're not sure about if they mean yes or no, I think it's a good idea to clarify with them, because I think sometimes they assume, Japanese people from a very young age, this is how we learn to kind of negotiate and communicate with each other. So there's less reliance on the actual words itself, but more on non-verbal means of communication. So silence is a big thing in Japan. A tone of voice, or eye movements or facial expressions, is all part of the communication in Japan, and it's assumed that you would understand the hidden meaning behind, or reading between the lines, I guess, to understand what they're saying. And in Japan, there's always a saying for everything in Japan, and it's called kuki o yomu, which is directly translated to reading the air. And it refers to the skill of understanding the situation without words, or sensing someone's feeling. So the kuki o yomu is something that from a very young age, we're kind of being taught, I guess, and it's a very important concept and skill to have in Japan. So I think it's really important to kind of understand the concept of this, and why Japanese people communicate like this. It's all about the harmony, saving face, protecting face, being polite, and not wanting to offend someone. So it's all about reading between the lines and hoping that people understand and know what you're meaning.
Yuri, can I ask you two questions?
Yeah.
One is, so you said saving face is very important. So one way of helping your client or your partner save face is by praising them in public, right? Is there other ways to help saving face, or to avoid, any other tips on how to avoid losing face?
So I think when you're, rejecting something, or if you're, just that, like, Japanese people don't really say no directly. I think it's important, if you're saying no to something, to try and also be indirect as well, in terms of how you say it. Like, instead of saying no, we're not doing that, maybe say in a way that's not in front of everybody, because if you say no to someone in front of a lot of people, it would really embarrass them, and they will feel like they've lost face in front of their colleagues or whoever it is in the meeting. So perhaps do that one-on-one at a later time, or do it in a follow-up to confirm that what you were saying is no. But in the actual kind of face-to-face context, especially in a meeting context where there are other people around, I think it's really important to make sure that the way you're saying the rejection or the no is kind of in a very roundabout, nice way. And usually Japanese people would, I guess, understand, as I said in some of those examples of what you might hear Japanese people say when they're actually referring to no, they will usually understand that what you're trying to convey is actually no, but you're not actually saying no, because you're understanding that you're reading the air, basically. Perfect.
No, and I like the idea of the reading the air, because it has to do with being monocultural, right? So they have been breathing the same air. In Australia, people come from all different types of air, so it's a bit different. And the other thing that I wanted to ask you is, you mentioned that Japanese are usually not very expressive emotionally, so you can't read their emotions on their face. So how do you know if they're happy or enjoying the conversation or not? Like, is there any other tips on what do we have to look out for?
I guess you'll have to learn how to read the air, but I think just nonverbal communication happens in every culture, and I think it's not, it doesn't not exist in Australia. I think it's just more prominent in cultures with high context. So it's actually just being a little bit more mindful and kind of, when you're in the conversation, just understand that, oh, maybe, they're saying yes, but they don't look like they're happy, or they're saying no, but why do they look, they don't look like they're. So it's kind of just understanding. I think if you're conscious about, during the conversation, if you're conscious about the fact that, this is how they communicate, I don't think, it's not like they don't smile or anything like that. Definitely, there's emotion involved, and there's facial expressions and things like that. So it's more about the words, I think, that they use. They might not specifically say a particular word, but I think most people will understand by the way that they're saying it, or the silence, or the eye movements, or the facial expressions and things like that. So, but otherwise, I think just asking is fine as well.
So asking and being super aware, right?
Yeah,
like just watch everything. Fantastic.
Yeah, just confirming with them, are you saying this? Like, just making sure that my understanding is correct. Are you actually saying this? Is my understanding correct? Is totally fine as well, because I think Japanese people, they just assume, I think, that you're understanding that, but it's totally fine to confirm whether that is what, if your understanding is correct or not. So whether you follow up on the spot or whether you follow up later on, if you're unsure, I think it's best to always clarify.
Great, thank you. I'll let you keep going now.
Wonderful. Have I finished on this slide? I think so. So that was the third point that I had on harmony. And the next point that I wanted to talk about is the loyalty side of Japan. So Japan is famous for taking a long time to make decisions, as per the previous example that I made of having to do the nemawashi, and the concept of collective decision making, rather than executive decision making. But in many cases, in most cases, if you invest time in building relationships with your Japanese counterpart, you will, in the most part, be rewarded with their loyalty. It's usually very unlikely that they, once they make that decision, that they will change, that they want to change, their suppliers or their partners. So the more time that you put into building that relationship with your Japanese clients, it really does pay off. But yeah, patience is key. So business relationships in Japan are more trust oriented and personal than what Australians might be used to. So it may take time to build it through face-to-face interactions and visiting Japan, and a fair amount of socializing. So business meetings during the day can be slow, but nighttime is often where the relationship is developed. And I realize how that sounds, but the Japanese like to refer to this as nominication. So nominication is a combination of two words, nomi, which means drinking, and they're specifically referring to alcohol here, and the English word communication. So nomi and communication becomes nominication. And it's a fascinating and well-established cultural practice within business in Japan that allows for open and frank discussion between team members, colleagues, from different groups, and even between the levels of seniority that I mentioned before. So simply put, nominication is about communicating with the help of alcoholic drinks. And as explained previously, Japanese people find it very tough to express themselves freely for fear of upsetting harmony or, perhaps showing disrespect. So nominication has become an acceptable outlet for the Japanese in terms of giving them a way of, speaking their minds without consequence. So anything said or done during nominication, whether it would have been otherwise, something that may have resulted in losing face or mentsu, all is forgiven the next day in the name of nominication. So yeah, it's really important to allow time in the night of the business meeting when you're setting up your itinerary and setting up business meetings. I think it's really important to make sure that you do have free in the night time of that meeting for a potential socializing offer, because as this kind of opportunity would make the process of the relationship building in Japan much faster And, as I mentioned, once the business relationship is formed, it is very often long-term. So I've dived into, 4 of the main kind of below the iceberg concepts of the Japanese business, loyalty and hierarchy and harmony and the formality of things like that. I wanted to just go into some, simple business culture in Japan 101. So business 101 information for everyone, so that, everyone listening in, so that you're best prepared for any future business meetings with Japanese counterparts. And, Austrade Murray in his presentation mentioned the famous business card culture in Japan. And I cannot stress enough how important and, how deep actually this, ritual and custom really is in Japan. So I wanted to kind of spend a little bit of time, explaining exactly, what happens in that first, time when you're meeting and greeting people in a business context in Japan. So business cards, meishi koukan in Japanese, or business card exchange, is a very important, ritual in a Japanese business context, and is based on respect and based on order of rank, which means there is, hierarchy, the hierarchical order that you do need to follow when you're exchanging business cards. The first thing is to come prepared, depending on the length of your stay or the types of the meetings that you'll be having, or the types of meetings that you're planning on attending when you're in Japan. Bring more than enough business cards. If you think, 100 business cards is enough, bring more, because the worst thing is to not have business cards to use, especially in networking functions where you'll be, meishi koukan, exchanging business cards left, right, and center with everyone that you meet. There's been, in my previous role when I was working for the Trade and Investment Office, state government in Japan, my role was to assist Queensland, companies, exporters like yourselves, export their products into Japan. So I was in a lot of business meetings and helping a lot of Queensland clients, doing business meetings and, business matching with Japanese clients. And there were many times that, I had assumed, that, they would bring enough business cards, and it was always more than they had envisioned. So there have been a few times that before a networking function at the very end of their itinerary, that I did a bit of a run to the 1 hour business card printing center to print, a few business cards for our clients as well. And even, when I first started working in that sector, I used to have nightmares of, being in meetings and not having business cards. It even came into my dreams. That's how important it is, and how, if you don't have business cards in that situation, that would, amount to, losing face, and it would be a very embarrassing situation for at least the Japanese side if you're meeting with someone without a business card. So if possible, and if available, it will be worth, if you're printing business cards, to print bilingual double-sided cards, so English and Japanese, if that's possible. So in a Japanese meeting, while one person may seem like the main conductor of a meeting, this doesn't necessarily mean that he or she is the highest ranking person, official in the room. So when meeting in a group setting, those in higher ranking positions should always be the first to exchange their business cards, and then working their way down in rank to the lowest position. Presenting the business card holding both hands is also really important. If you do print a bilingual card, the Japanese side should be facing forward. So your name facing, so from their point of view, the name should be facing them. So the opposite of what you're seeing. And the business cards should be accepted with both hands as well. And sometimes you might see a bit of a game back and forward going, because usually this, the hierarchy comes in here as well. When you're in a lower rank position, your business card should be placed underneath the person who is higher than you. And then if you're around the same kind of level, there's a bit of a game going on, because you're going lower and lower and lower. And at some point, one of you will kind of give you a business card. So that's a little kind of, funny hierarchy game that happens in business card culture. So when you receive the business cards, it's important to arrange the cards that you receive accordingly, as it will help you keep track of who to address and how to address them according to their rank. So when you sit down, usually the business cards are put on your desk in accordance to the level of their seniority. So the person who is the most senior in the room, their business card should be placed on the top, and then so on and so forth. So one big no-no in Japan when it comes to business card is it's very important to never write notes on the business cards when you receive it during meetings. So the business card is meant to represent that person's face. So writing on it would mean that you're writing on their face, staining their face, and that is considered very rude. So that it's really important to note that never write anything on someone's business cards, and just treat the business cards with respect. As I said, that represents the other person's face. So if they see you kind of using that business card in flicking it or putting it straight into your pocket, it might they might consider it a little bit rude. So in their presence, when you receive their business card, treat it really, really carefully and make sure that you treat it with respect.
Yuri, I think there is a couple of questions.
Yeah, I saw some questions coming in. Yep.
So do you give a business card to every person in the meeting? If you go to visit trade, do you give a card to all who try our wine?
Generally, I would say yes. People would want to exchange business cards I guess in your question about kind of expo and things like that, and people coming to your booth and drinking wine, I think that might depend on the level of interaction that you might have. If they're just stepping by for a little sip of wine, that might be a bit of a transactional, so you might not have to do a business card. But if a conversation happens and you go so far as to introduce each other and you talk about where you're from and they're an importer, and you have that initial conversation to break the initial ice, I think it's really and then in that case you would exchange business cards. So if you're walking and someone just sips and you don't have a verbal conversation, I don't think you don't need to have a business card. But in a meeting sense, in your original question, in a meeting, yes, everyone in the meeting physically present would be exchanging business cards, unless sometimes there might be someone in there that is simply bringing tea or something. They're not actually there for a meeting, but they're there for the AV, or they're there to just for the tea or something. That person might not necessarily need to have a business card. But yeah, otherwise, if they're there to talk about that specific topic and they're there for the meeting, definitely a business card.
And the other question is interesting, because Yuri and I were talking about this. Do Japanese use electronic business cards, like tap to mobile phone?
Honestly, no. And this was a shock to me, because I moved back to Australia last year, having spent about 8 years working in Japan in my previous role. In the trade and investment Queensland I was based in, assisting Queensland companies exporting their products to Japan. So I was very much in the business card culture. And then when I moved to Australia and went to my first meeting, with my business cards, I printed it specifically for it. It was a networking event. And no one in Australia had business cards. They simply said, oh, we can connect on LinkedIn. And it was a culture shock for me. I didn't realize that in Australia, the eco-friendliness, and it makes total sense to me. It does make total sense to me that, you don't need a card. Why can't it be digital? Why can't it be, we can connect by some people had a QR code, and it was just, it's really not the case in Japan. And they'll be interested. They'll understand, as I said, Japanese people are coming in knowing that they're doing business with a foreigner. So they will have an understanding. If you don't have a business card, it'll be from their point of view, it'll be something unusual, but it's not like they'll be very, very angry, because they know that they're also doing business with someone that's not from their culture as well. But to make things smoother, I think it would definitely be worth printing, if you don't already, printing paper Japanese business cards, and if it's bilingual, even better. But yeah, electronic business cards is not a thing in Japan, and I'm not sure if or when if it will ever become something, but I just cannot stress enough how important business cards are in Japan. And I mean, there are technology now when you do receive the business cards in Japan. There's a technology where you can scan the business card onto this app, and it actually stores all the information, all the information in one document. So instead of, there used to be a filing system that people would just put business cards in files. But that side of the management of the business cards and the information on the business cards management side, there's technologies around that, but the actual business card itself is still very much a physical paper-based, and it's still a very a ritualistic concept. So I know that we only have 10 minutes left, but thankfully I only have one more slide, I think, on the next Business 101 topic. So I might move on to the next and last slide. I think it is anyway. No, I have 2 slides left, sorry. So the next one is just on business meetings in general. So in Japan, punctuality is highly valued in Japan. Everyone is expected to be on time for meetings and appointments. And when I say on time, I actually mean 10 minutes early. Like, on time actually means early in Japan. So in primary school, I did primary school in Japan, and we learned from a very early age this concept called gohunmai kodo, which is 5 minutes before. So every classroom, every lesson, every class, every sporting event, gohunmai kodo is very, very important. You have to arrive 5 minutes before. That is the on time, the definition of on time. 5 minutes before. The reason I wrote 10 minutes, the reason I'm saying 10 minutes for a business context is when there are many people involved, and there are going to be some people kind of walking around, they're going to be chatter. I think 10 minutes early in a business meeting context, in a professional context, is really important. But in a general culture context, I think 5 to 10 minutes early is kind of the standard in Japan, and it's, as I said, punctuality is very important. As I mentioned, bowing is the standard greeting in Japan, not shaking hands. But as I mentioned, some Japanese people might, if they're well versed with the foreign way of doing business, they might offer their handshake. So unless led by the Japanese side, go for the bow. But otherwise, some might be comfortable shaking hands as well. Japanese love and an agenda. Usually in every formal meeting, there'll be a very, very specific set agenda that they will have and that they will follow as well. And usually they're printed as well. So similarly to the business card conversation, Japan, even though the rest of the world is becoming very eco-friendly and, devices, no paper, Japan, I find, is still very, very much paper-based. So not just business cards, but the agenda. And also, I think it would really help to have printed copies of, your brochures or your handouts or your presentations. There were several occasions where, Australian clients would come and they wouldn't have any physical brochures, but they would simply bring a USB. And to be frank, it's Japanese people, it probably, they might open it once, and then they might not see it again. If it's or they might print it themselves. That's the thing. They would receive your USB, they'll open it up on their computer, they would print it and then use that anyway. So the hard copies of things is still very much important. And if you are going to do a presentation, it would really help to have printed copies of them for each person who will be at the meeting. Another thing I mentioned, that the Japanese low English language, and of course it really depends on the company as well, and how global and how much international projects that they do. But generally, if it's a really important meeting, it would be good to have a translator there, and Japanese people would prefer to have a Japanese national translator, so a translator whose Japanese is their first language would be a preference from the Japanese side. There are also strict rules around seating arrangements as well in meetings. So when you walk into a meeting room, don't sit, in the nearest in any seat. Usually there's seating, either specifically seating arrangements for some really formal meetings, but even in normal kind of first meetings, the senior role person sits furthest from the entrance, and then the junior role, they sit at the entrance side, the door side of the meeting, is generally how the seating arrangements are made. Silence is also really not uncommon in Japan. I know this gets talked about a lot in Japan, but silence is not a bad thing. It's indicating a period of reflection in a meeting. So Japanese people don't find it really uncomfortable having a bit of silence in a meeting. So when that happens, don't kind of be alarmed, because it does happen quite often in Japan. The other thing is, don't rush the initial small talk. I think, engaging in small talk, while exchanging business cards is a really important process in the Japanese first meeting. I think even though these processes may seem really long, I think they're a really important part of establishing the relationship and building that initial trust and loyalty needing to kind of support the future business. So don't rush the small talk side of things, and don't rush the exchanging business cards time that happens before the formal meeting, because that's kind of where the first building of the relationship and building of the trust process starts. And the last thing is, I know that I don't have much time, so decisions are actually seldom made in the actual meeting. Relating to the nemawashi that I mentioned before about there be needing to have the foundation of people's collective decision before coming to an actual decision. Usually decisions are not made in the actual meeting. A few meetings are needed, and also often follow-up are needed. So they may follow up later on in an email or a call with their final decision. But yeah, in the actual meeting, sometimes even in the agenda, if the decision is, even if you come into the meeting thinking that there'll be a yes or a no answer, generally you won't have that final answer at the end of the meeting. In the last really few minutes left, I'll just go over just really briefly about the trends in alcohol consumption in Japan. So the drinking culture in the younger generation in Japan is actually changing, also due to the aging population, but also the post-pandemic lifestyle change. A lot less younger generation in Japan are actually drinking. So interestingly, last year, the Japan's tax agency, so the country's the agency that regulates the liquor industry in Japan, they held a campaign or a contest to encourage more drinking more drinking among the young people. That's how they're desperate for more young people to drink more. The loyal drinkers in Japan, the remaining drinkers are actually really, really highly engaged and really knowledgeable about the brands and the countries of origin and the region that that the alcohol comes from. So I think those are the real targets of the younger generation. And I think Murray mentioned this in his presentation as well, but the alternative categories are really becoming popular. So whether they're the natural wines or the organic certified ones, or even canned wines, or really different kind of non-alcoholic wines, or those kind of alternative categories are becoming really, really popular in Japan. And that's the end of my presentation, and I did not leave much time for questions, and I'm so sorry about that, but
that's all right. We already had some questions before, but I think we have a little video to share. Yep. Just before we wrap up. Is that okay, Alice, if we share the video? Yes.
Japan is a market where you need to have a lot of patience. It is not a fast moving place. It is pretty much the antithesis to, say, China, where you sort of just get in and you can make the deal and you can move things and run new projects and everything kind of happens on the fly. I would say kind of Japan is the opposite of that. And I think What's also interesting about Japan is people I think also have to consider and really take into account that it is one of the last monocultures, really true monocultures left in the world, and that Japanese culture is still so very, very strong and intact. I would say it takes a long time to get involved with Japanese business, but once you have that kind of trust established, Japanese partners can be extremely loyal and they're almost always in it for the long term. I regularly meet people, you know, in these businesses that have been there for 27 years, 30 years, 18 years, you know, so paying your dues and this collective nature of decision making. People don't want to rock the boat, so all of that again lends itself to things taking quite a long time. The initial business development chance and getting the first meeting is fairly mainstream. You know, you can find online or contact Wine Australia to find out, you know, who some good importers are, and then you literally contact them and you know, send your proposal and try and get that first meeting. You know, that's the step in any business development. Things are shifting kind of rapidly, you know, in the alcohol space, and there's competition across so many sectors. You know, you've got craft products in so many categories, you've got seltzer. It's hard to, you know, make your voice heard above this throng of products, styles, categories. Japanese companies will get approaches from wineries from all over the world. So you need to really try and hone down and say, what is my USP? What is my proof point? You know, what am I all about? Take that time to build that relationship, because once you have a good relationship with a Japanese partner, it will usually be long lasting and fruitful. You always want to make it as simple as possible for your partner. So if you can be hardworking, get them what they want, do it in a, you know, light-hearted, but, you know, you're working hard together kind of fashion, then I think that's you're on the right path. But I think you've got to believe in what you do, believe in your products, because again, you know, we're competing against Spain, Italy, France, Chile. So, you know, it's hugely competitive in Asia because the majority of those countries don't produce any of their own wine. Japan does have an industry, obviously, but yeah, it's you really, you know, it's a global marketplace.
Great, and I think we're all back. Rose, on to you.
Thank you, that was wonderful. Actually, Rory, I laughed when you were talking about seating arrangements, because I've been here a long time and I still to this day do not sit down until someone tells me, you sit here, or I've checked where I'm sitting down. There was a lot of interest about business cards as well. I think USB, when you were talking about that, so relevant, so true. So thank you both to yourself and to Marcella for taking the time to share such a great presentation with us all. It's really helpful, I think. So thank you.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you, everyone. And please reach out if you have any more questions. We are happy to help.
Wonderful. And thank you as well to all of our participants for taking time in your busy schedule to join us today. We'll take a recording of the session and we'll email everyone when it's up and live on our website. So thank you for joining the session today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. See you later.